My parents always made it clear I was never their favorite. But when I finally turned my life around and bought my own home, suddenly, they wanted a piece of it. My entitled brother and his wife decided my house should be theirs, and they went to insane lengths to take it from me. They kicked me out when I was struggling, but now they're the ones desperate and they never saw my revenge coming. I always knew where I stood with my family on the outside looking in. My younger brother, the golden child, could do no wrong, while I was an afterthought, a spare part in a family that had already picked its favorite. It had been that way since we were kids. And even as we got older, nothing changed. So when life threw me a curveball and I lost everything, I should have known better than to think my family would be there for me. Instead, they did what they always did, sided with my brother and made sure I knew exactly where I stood. But they made a mistake. They thought I would always be the one left behind, struggling to get by, barely making ends meet. What they didn't expect was that I would build myself back up. And when I did, they came running, not to congratulate me, but to take what I had worked for. It all started when I lost my job. I had a decent career, a comfortable place to live, and while I wasn't swimming in money, I was doing fine. Then, just like that, everything was gone. My lease was up, my roommate moved out, and I had no way to keep the place on my own. I tried to find another apartment, something cheap, but even the smallest studio was out of reach. With no other options, I did the only thing I could. I moved into a camper. I had always loved trucks, so at least I had one thing going for me. I found an old camper in decent shape, spent what little I had left fixing it up, and told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I figured it was better than being on the street. My plan was simple. I'd stay with my parents for a little while, park my camper in their driveway, and get things sorted. But of course, that wasn't an option. When I asked my parents for help, they didn't just say no, they laughed in my face. They told me there wasn't enough room, that they couldn't just let me stay for free. If I wanted to park my camper there, I'd have to pay them rent more than I would have paid for a cheap apartment. And my brother and his wife? They were delighted. They stood there, smirking, calling me a bum, telling me I deserved it. My brother had a house full of kids, a wife who refused to work, and yet, somehow, I was the one they looked down on. So, I left. I spent months living wherever I could store parking lots, back alleys, anywhere no one would notice me. I had to sneak electricity from buildings just to keep my tiny fridge running. I was exhausted, constantly on edge, wondering if someone would try to break in while I slept. And the worst part? My parents knew. They knew exactly what I was going through, and they didn't care. They had a house, plenty of space, and they could have helped me. But why would they? I wasn't their favorite. Eventually, I caught a break. After months of searching, I finally found a job. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and it paid well enough that I could start saving again. My boss even let me park my camper behind the warehouse so I'd have a safe place to stay. It wasn't a home, but it was better than the streets. And I worked hard. I took every shift, every extra hour I could get. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was determined to change my life. And I did. I saved every dollar I could, and by the time I had enough for a down payment, I found a house, a small, 3-bedroom place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I put my entire savings into it, and finally, after years of struggling, I had something no one could take away from me. I had a home. I should have known better than to tell my family. I made a post about it online, celebrating my success, proud of what I had accomplished. And that's when they came crawling back. My parents and brothers showed up at my doorstep, unannounced, acting like nothing had ever happened. They walked through my house like they owned it, commenting on how much space there was, how perfect it would be for a real family. My brother pulled me aside, grinning like he had just won the lottery, and told me that he and his wife had made a decision they were going to move in, not asked, told. I stood there, stunned. as he explained his grand plan. My house was too big for just one person, he said. It made sense for them to live there. His wife was pregnant again, and they needed more space. And I could live in the camper. After all, I was used to it. It would just be like before. I finally snapped. For the first time in my life, I didn't just roll over and let them have their way. I told him no. Not just no, but a loud, firm, undeniable hell no. The look on his face was priceless, pure shock, as if the idea that I might say no had never even crossed his mind. But he wasn't done. He called in our parents, and suddenly the whole family was in my house, surrounding me, demanding I give in. My mother begged me to just do this for my brother, saying I didn't need all this space anyway. My father stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to fall in line like I always had. My sister-in-law played the victim, crying about how hard things were for them, how unfair it was that I had a house, and they didn't. I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. I told them all to get out. My mother gasped like I had slapped her. My brother started yelling, saying I was selfish, ungrateful, that family is supposed to help each other. I laughed in his face and reminded him exactly how much help he had given me when I needed it. Not a single word from him after that. And then his wife lost it. She lunged at me, screaming, and actually managed to land a hit before my brother pulled her back. That was it. I pulled out my phone, held it up, and told them all I had recorded everything. If they didn't leave, I'd call the cops and press charges for assault. That shut them up real quick. As they walked out the door, my mother turned to me one last time and said I would regret this, that I was going to lose my family. I just smiled. I had already lost them a long time ago. The only difference was, now I had finally let them go. The silence didn't last long. Just days after I threw my family out of my house, the calls and messages started pouring in. At first, it was just my mother, leaving voicemails laced with guilt, reminding me that family is forever. Then came my brother, his messages filled with anger, demanding that I make things right. Right, as if I had done something wrong by refusing to hand over the home I had worked for. And then, of course, my sister-in-law crying, playing the victim, saying that I was cruel, selfish, heartless. The same woman who had mocked me for being homeless now expected my sympathy because I wouldn't let her take what was mine. I ignored them all. I had spent too many years letting them dictate my life, and I wasn't about to let them start again. I was done, but, of course, they weren't. A week later, I came home from work to find them back at my house. My parents, my brother, and his entire family standing on my porch like they belonged there. My mother was the first to speak, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, as if she hadn't spent my entire childhood making it clear that I was nothing compared to my brother. "We just want to talk," she said, trying to push her way inside. "I didn't move. We already talked," I reminded her. And the answer is still no. My father's face hardened, his usual scowl settling in. My brother, however, grinned, acting like I was the one being difficult. "Come on, man," he said, as if we were friends, as if we had ever been friends. "Let's be reasonable." I crossed my arms. "Reasonable? You mean like when you laughed at me for being homeless? Or when you called me a bum? Or do you mean reasonable like when you tried to steal my house?" That wiped the smirk off his face. My sister-in-law, always ready to play her part, suddenly started crying. She clutched her stomach dramatically, reminding me again that she was pregnant. "I just don't understand," she sobbed. "You have all this space, and we have nothing. How can you be so cruel?" I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me. Cruel? I was cruel? Where was this energy when they threw me out? When I had nowhere to go? When I was sleeping in a parking lot, praying that no one would break into my camper? "Get off my property," I said, my voice ice cold. That's when my mother snapped. The sweet act was gone, replaced with the woman I had known my entire life, the woman who always made sure I knew I was second best. "You ungrateful little brat," she spat. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us?" I laughed. I actually laughed. Everything you've done for me? You mean nothing? Because that's what you've done, nothing." My father stepped forward, clearly trying to intimidate me, but I held my ground. "You don't get to talk to your mother that way," he warned. "You don't get to tell me what to do," I shot back. "Not anymore." That's when my brother made his move. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head like I was the crazy one. "We're not leaving. We're moving in." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. But then, before I could even process the audacity, he waved his hand, and suddenly, his wife and kids were pushing past me, carrying boxes, actual moving boxes. They weren't asking. They weren't negotiating. They were just taking. I saw red. I stormed inside, grabbed my phone, and called the police. The moment my brother saw what I was doing, he panicked. "Oh, come on. Don't be like that," he said, his voice suddenly shaky. "This is a family matter. You don't need to involve the cops." I stared at him, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "You broke into my house," I said slowly. "You changed the locks. You brought moving boxes. You're trespassing. This isn't a family matter. It's a crime." My sister-in-law shrieked, launching into another tantrum about how I was ruining their lives, about how I was being unfair. My mother tried to plead with me, her voice softer now, trying one last time to guilt me into caving. But I didn't cave. Not this time. The cops arrived within minutes, and when they saw the boxes and the new lock my brother had installed on my front door, it was game over. My brother tried to argue, tried to spin some lie about how I had agreed to let them stay. But there was just one little problem. The signature on their so-called rental agreement wasn't mine. The officer held up the forged document and raised an eyebrow. "You really thought this was going to work?" My brother didn't have an answer. The cops gave them two choices: leave willingly or be arrested. My mother gasped, clutching her chest like the very idea of facing consequences was enough to kill her. My father turned red, his face filled with pure rage, but even he knew better than to fight the police. My brother, however, stood there, shaking with anger, staring at me like I had betrayed him. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "No," I said. "You did that when you thought you could steal from me." They had no choice. They packed up their boxes, threw them back into their car, and left. My mother cried the whole time. My sister-in-law screamed about how unfair life was. My father said nothing. And my brother? He didn't even look at me as he got in the driver's seat. For the first time in my life, I watched as they walked away and I felt nothing. No guilt, no sadness, just relief. I changed my locks the very next day, installed security cameras, and let my neighbors know what had happened just in case my family decided to try again. I thought that would be the end of it, that they would finally leave me alone, but I underestimated them. Because if my brother and his wife couldn't steal my house, they would find another way to make me pay. I thought that after calling the cops on my brother and his family, they would finally get the message, that they would finally understand that I wasn't playing their game anymore. But if there was one thing I should have learned by now, it was that they never stop. It started with silence. No calls, no messages, nothing. For the first time in my life, my phone wasn't buzzing with guilt trips, demands, or fake apologies. I should have felt at peace, but instead, I knew better. They were planning something. And I was right. A week after the police escorted them off my property, my mother showed up at my door, alone. No brother, no father, no screaming sister-in-law. Just her, standing on my porch, clutching her purse like a woman in mourning. I didn't let her in. I didn't even open the screen door. She sighed, a deep, dramatic breath, and said, "Can we talk?" I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "We don't have anything to talk about." Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were already losing her patience. "You don't have to be like this. We're family." I almost laughed. Family? Where was that sentiment when I was sleeping in a camper, trying to find a job? Where was that love when I had begged them for a place to park my truck? I shook my head. I don't have family. I have people who used me until they couldn't anymore. She flinched like I had slapped her. That's not fair. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, fair? You want to talk about fair? How fair was it when you let Dan laugh at me for being homeless? Or when you let his wife call me a bum? Or when you tried to give my house to him? She looked away, staring down at the porch like it suddenly fascinated her. That's why I'm here, she murmured. To fix things, I snorted. You're not here to fix anything. You're here because you realized you can't control me anymore, and you don't like it. Her head snapped up, and for a brief second, I saw the mask slip. The mother I had known my entire life, cold, calculating, entitled. But she caught herself, smoothing her features into something softer, something more pitiful. She sighed again. Dan is struggling. His family is struggling. That's not my problem. Her face twisted into something ugly. How can you be so selfish? I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. Because I learned it from you, she gasped, looking horrified, as if she couldn't believe I would say such a thing. But I was done pretending, done acting like they weren't the ones who made me this way. She adjusted her purse, her fingers tightening around the strap. We were hoping you would reconsider. I exhaled sharply. No. Her jaw tightened. Not even to help your brother? I grinned. Especially not to help my brother. Her nostrils flared, and just like that, the fake kindness was gone. She straightened, her voice turning sharp. If you don't help him, he'll have nowhere to go. I shrugged. Sounds like a him problem. Her lips pursed, and I knew that was it. That was the final straw. She had tried pity, guilt, manipulation, but nothing had worked. She took a step back, her eyes cold. You'll regret this. I met her gaze evenly. No, you will. She left after that, her heels clicking against the pavement as she stomped back to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling nothing. No guilt, no second guessing, just relief. But of course, it wasn't over. Because the very next morning, I woke up to a moving truck in my driveway. I thought I was dreaming at first, that I had to be imagining it. But no, there it was, parked in my driveway, my brother's van right behind it. They were doing it again. I stormed outside, still in my pajama pants, my heart pounding with fury. My brother was standing by the truck, directing the movers like he had already won. My father was there too, arms crossed, acting like he had any authority over me. What the hell is this? I demanded. Dan turned, flashing me that same smug grin. We're moving in. For a second, I actually felt lightheaded from how insane this was. Are you serious? My father finally spoke, his voice calm, like this was some kind of negotiation. Your mother and I talked about it. We think this is what's best for the family. We think. Not I think. Not Dan thinks. We. Like they were some royal council deciding my fate. I stared at them, barely able to contain my rage. Let me make this very clear. You are not moving in, Dan scoffed. You're being ridiculous. We need this house more than you do. I clenched my fists. It's my house. You don't get to decide that. Dan stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. Look, you can either let us move in peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. I laughed. Actually laughed. Oh, buddy, you do not want the hard way, he smirked. What are you gonna do? Call the cops again? I met his gaze and pulled my phone out of my pocket. Actually? Yeah. His face paled, but my father stepped in. You don't have to do this. I lifted my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, you better start packing. The movers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. They had no idea what kind of mess they had walked into. Then my mother arrived. She came rushing out of her car, breathless, like she had just run a marathon. What's going on? She demanded. Dan turned to her, his voice laced with frustration. He's calling the cops! She spun to me, her expression wild. Why are you doing this? We're family. I didn't even flinch. No, we're not. You made sure of that a long time ago. She stared at me, her lips trembling, as if she couldn't believe I wasn't bending to her will, as if she had never actually considered that I might not obey. I pressed the call button. Dan cursed. My mother started pleading. My father muttered something under his breath, but it didn't matter, because I had already won. The cops arrived minutes later, and once again, my family was forced to leave. My brother and his wife screamed about how I was ruining their lives. My mother sobbed like the victim. She always pretended to be, and my father just stared at me like he still couldn't believe I had grown a backbone. As they drove away, I felt something I had never felt before. Freedom. But I knew it wasn't over, because if my family couldn't steal my house, they were going to find another way to take from me. And their next move? It would be something I'd never forgive. I thought after calling the cops on them again, they would finally understand that this was my house, that I wasn't playing their game anymore, that I was done with them and their nonsense. But if I had learned anything by now, it was that my family didn't give up. Not when there was something they wanted. And they wanted my house. For the first time in my life, though, I wasn't afraid of them. I wasn't a kid anymore, desperately trying to win their love. I had my own home, my own job, my own life, and I wasn't about to let them take it from me. I just didn't realize how low they would go to try. The silence lasted about a week. I didn't hear from them. No calls, no messages, no surprise visits. But I knew it wouldn't last. I knew them too well, and I was right. It started with a letter, a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox. No return address, but I didn't need one to know exactly who it was from. I opened it right there on my porch, my stomach twisting in knots. And the moment I saw what was inside, I laughed. Not because it was funny, not because it was some kind of joke. I laughed because they were insane. Inside was a formal legal document, a demand for money. No, not just money, reimbursement. They were billing me for my own childhood, food, clothes, school supplies, medical expenses. They had itemized lists. And at the very bottom, the total, $87,432. I stared at it, feeling the anger rise in my chest. $87,000 for being born. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, there was a handwritten note from my mother tucked inside. "We have given you everything. The least you can do is support your family now. We expect this money within the next 6 months, or we will be forced to take legal action." I read it twice, 3 times. My hands trembled with fury. They really thought they could guilt me into paying them for existing. For a moment, I almost ripped the letter to shreds. But then, I stopped myself, because this was proof of how little they had ever cared about me. So instead, I walked inside, set the papers down on my kitchen table, and picked up my phone. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. "Oh, you got our letter. Not hello, not how are you. Just straight to the demand." I took a slow breath. "Are you serious?" She sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "This isn't an unreasonable request. You're an adult now. You have a house. You make good money." I cut her off. "I have a mortgage. I have bills. I have expenses, just like everyone else. You're out of your mind if you think I'm giving you a single dime." Silence. Then the sharp edge of her voice returned. "You owe us." I almost laughed again. "I owe you? For what? For kicking me out? For treating me like an afterthought while you handed everything to Dan? For letting him and his wife mock me when I had nothing?" She sucked in a breath, but I wasn't finished. "You're not getting a cent from me. And if you even think about trying to take me to court over this, I will fight it. And I will win." Another pause. And then a sharp, bitter laugh. "Fine. If that's how you want to be, then you'll regret this." Click! She hung up. I thought that was the end of it, that they had finally hit a wall they couldn't climb over. But the next morning, I woke up to another surprise. A moving truck. Again, I nearly lost my mind right then and there. But this time, they weren't moving Dan in. They were moving me out. Boxes were already being stacked on my front lawn. 2 men, professional movers. By the look of them, were hauling furniture through the front door. My furniture. I ran outside, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell do you think YOURE doing?" One of the movers looked up, confused. We were hired to clear out the house. My stomach dropped. They had actually hired movers to evict me from my own home. I stormed through the door, my blood boiling. And there, standing in my living room like he owned the place, was my father. He didn't even flinch when he saw me. "You weren't supposed to be home." I clenched my fists. "Are you actually out of your mind?" He folded his arms. "You don't deserve this house. You never did." I stared at him, stunned. After everything they had done, this was how they saw me? Like a thief. Like I had stolen something from them. "I'm calling the cops," I said, pulling out my phone. For the third time, my father's face twisted in fury. "You wouldn't." I pressed dial. And this time, I didn't just threaten. I pressed charges. My parents, my brother, and his wife spent the night in jail for trespassing, attempted theft, and unlawful eviction. They were not happy, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care. The rest of my family heard about it fast. The story spread through cousins, aunts, uncles, people I hadn't talked to in years. Some were horrified by what my parents had done. Others, predictably, thought I was being too harsh. But I didn't care what any of them thought, because I was done. Done trying to reason with them. Done pretending they would ever change. Done letting them manipulate me. The next day, I changed the locks, installed security cameras, got a restraining order, and when my mother finally called me again, begging me to fix this, I gave her the only answer she deserved. I don't have a family anymore. And for the first time in my life, I finally felt free. I thought that was the end of it. That after pressing charges, after calling the police on them for the third time, after getting a restraining order, they would finally back off. I was wrong. Because people like them, they don't learn, they don't change. They just find another way to get what they want. And this time, they didn't come for my house. They came for me. It started small, a few calls from unknown numbers. At first, I ignored them, but they kept coming, dozens of them. Finally, one night, I picked up. A voice I didn't recognize, but the tone was all too familiar. "Do you really think you can cut your family off like this?" I didn't even respond. I just hung up and blocked the number, but the calls kept coming. Different numbers, different voices, but the same message. "You're selfish. You're cruel. Your parents raised you, and this is how you repay them? Flying monkeys." People the first didn't even know, but who had somehow been convinced that I was the villain. That I had wronged my family by not letting them take my house. I ignored them. And then, one morning, I stepped outside and froze. Because there, on my truck, was egg, smashed all over the windshield, dripping down the sides. At first I thought it was just some random vandalism, maybe some bored kids pulling a prank. But then I checked the cameras, and my stomach dropped. The figure was covered up, hood, scarf, big glasses, but the height, the build, the way they moved. It was her. Still, I called the cops, filed another report, but there wasn't enough evidence to prove it was her. So she got away with it, and I had a feeling she knew it. For a while, things went quiet again. The calls slowed down, the harassment stopped. And for the first time in months, I relaxed. I thought maybe, just maybe, they were done, that they had finally given up. Then, one night, there was a knock at my door. I checked the camera, and there she was, standing on my porch like she had every right to be there. I took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on. She smiled, smirked, really. "We need to talk." I didn't bother hiding my disgust. "We really don't." Her smile didn't falter. "Come on, you're being childish. You got what you wanted, didn't you? You won." I narrowed my eyes. "Then why are you here?" She sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her stomach. The same act she always pulled. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Dan is a mess. My kids are suffering. We don't have anywhere to go." I crossed my arms. "That's not my problem." Her expression hardened. "You could fix this. You could make everything right again." I let out a short laugh. "Right. By handing over my house, moving back into a camper, letting you and Dan take everything from me? She scowled. You're unbelievable. And that's when she snapped. In a split second, she lunged forward and shoved against the door. I barely managed to hold it shut. Are you insane? She clawed at the chain. You ruined my life. You selfish, ungrateful. I grabbed my phone, held it up so she could see. I'm calling the cops. Right now. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wild, and for a second, I thought she might actually attack me. But then, just as quickly as she snapped, she broke. The rage vanished. Her face crumbled, and she started crying. I just don't know what to do, she sobbed. I can't live like this. I can't go back to my parents' house. I have 4 kids. I need a home. I need help. I stared at her, feeling nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, because I knew what she was. A manipulator, a liar, a user. And now that she had lost everything, she was desperate. But not my problem. I stepped back and shut the door in her face, locked it, and called the cops. Again, that was the last time I saw her. She was arrested that night for harassment and trespassing. And when she got out, she ran, left the state, left her kids, left everything behind. Dan got full custody. My parents, who had once worshipped her, now refused to even say her name. And me? I went back to my life. The calls stopped. The harassment ended. The flying monkeys disappeared. I was free. And for the first time in years, I had something I never thought I'd have: peace. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, often the hard way. One of the most important truths we can learn is that family is not defined by blood, but by respect, love, and mutual care. Too often, people hold on to toxic relationships simply because of shared history, believing that they owe something to those who mistreat them. But no one, not even family, has the right to take advantage of your kindness, your stability, or your success. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your own peace is to walk away from those who refuse to treat you with the same love and respect you give them. It's never easy, but standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. When you set boundaries, you teach people how to treat you. And when you refuse to be manipulated, you reclaim your power. In the end, happiness isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about surrounding yourself with the people who truly value you. Whether they are friends, a partner, or even just yourself, the family you choose will always be more important than the one you're born into. Protect your peace. It's worth more than any obligation to those who never valued you in the first place.